All right, there we go. Okay, so today's subject is about building overall design concepts, right? So as usual, we'll start with a recap of what we covered last time. Excuse me, which was driven design, meaning the things that the script tells us, versus artistic choice, which are the decisions we make on our own as we do our design. We also talked about such things as how you read the script. Well, first time we read it through as the audience, second time we read it as a craftsperson, the third time through we read it as a designer. Next, we'll talk about the things we use in our design concepts: color, form, movement, sound, texture, and more. So all the different aspects of design that come into what we're doing. So your not homework for this week was to read the script, The Brown Shoes, and come up with a basic design concept. You could choose any subject you wanted, you could choose any design department you wanted, but overall, we just wanted to look at what you came up with. So when we're talking about concept, one of the things that's important to remember is that everybody's grasp of a given concept is slightly different, right? So the question I like to ask is, where is your park? If I say, think of a park, what park do you think of? Think about that for a moment. Don't have to say anything, but get a clear image in your head of the particular park that comes to mind. Because when I say park, you're probably thinking of a specific park from your childhood, from growing up, from something you remember. So what is your park? Well, here's mine. So where I grew up in Bloomington, Illinois, there was a park called Miller Park. And these are some of the things that were at the park. There's a pavilion, an old train, because the town of Bloomington was a very big train switching location and warehouse area. And there's this bridge over the pond at Miller Park. And those are all things that are distinctly part of my concept of a park. Now, I'm willing to bet whatever park you had in your mind doesn't match these images. These are particular to the park that's in my mind. There's also playground equipment that was specific to that park. There was a small zoo in that park. At one time, it was actually the smallest accredited zoo in the United States, but it was very close to my house, so we went there a lot. So my idea of a park includes a small zoo, and my idea of a zoo is still shaped by that zoo. So when you're coming up with your design concept and you say it's set in a park, like this show is, you know that your park and my park are different parks, right? So when you're designing and you're working with other designers and you're working with directors and the other people on the show, you have to be aware that when you say park, it doesn't necessarily narrow things down quite as much as it might in your own head, right? So we're going to talk about what your concept of the show is. But in the end, as designers, our concept, your concept, is not the fundamental decider, but rather what is our concept as a group, as a design team, as a production team. The designer, the director, the production staff, even the actors influence the final result, as well as things like budget and space and where the audience is in relation to your show. When you're looking at designing for a proscenium theater versus a black box theater, that also influences your concept, right? So how do we arrive at a concept that fits all of those requirements, matches what each of the different design departments wants, what the director wants? So our first thing is the author's concept, what the author has told us. So in this script, we know that it seems to be a fairly normal environment as far as what the location is, what the scenery is, time period, all of those sorts of things. It's very kind of natural, what we expect day to day, but it's a very strange situation that our protagonist in this show has encountered, right? And then the next thing we're going to look at is, what is the director's concept? Well, in this case, I'm playing the role of the director, and I told you that I was looking for that the things that are normal are very normal, and anything suggesting that anything is particularly out of the ordinary, right? But as things get weird, I said I wanted the things that were weird to be very weird, go over the top, make them a little more than even maybe the script requires, right? So that was your assignment. Given the script and given my concept, I asked you guys to come up with some concepts of your own. And a few of you sent those in, which is fantastic. So we're going to take a quick look at some of those, some of these designer concepts, all right? So let's see what you came up with. So the first one is, there's a fence surrounding a large patch of grass with a marble-like sidewalk surrounding it. There are buildings in the background in the rest of the downtown area. Inside the fence looks like a party. There's a part of the fence that can swing to let people in and out of the grassed area. There are multiple tables and benches in the grassed area, along with 2 blue chairs. All right, so to quickly talk about some of the things that this particular design concept covers is, this one seems to be mostly about the scenery of it. The fence surrounding the large patch of grass and the marble sidewalk, which if we refer to the script, those things are, whoops, wrong window. That one. When we look at the script, a lot of those things are given to us by the director. We've got the fenced in place. We've got the private park, the party, the marble sidewalk, the fence, the blue chairs, all of those sorts of things. Those come directly from the script, which is, of course, an important part of what we're looking at. But some of the other things that we are given in this design concept is the fact that we've got the background of the rest of the downtown area is what we're looking at too. So the scene doesn't end at the edge of the park. That is the main subject of our thing. So this designer has given some thought to what exists in the world beyond the park. And so that's an important part of our design concept. Okay. The next thing we'll look at is another design concept. So this is just the very first part of this person's design concept. Oops, apparently clicked twice because, the computer is running slow today. So in the beginning, Steph appears in a spotlight and you slowly bring up the surrounding light. Again, this is taken directly from the script. That was the author's suggestion, and it sort of brings the people into the world, especially given that our script starts with the main character speaking directly to the audience. So we know that sort of separates her out for that opening monologue from the scenery around her. By bringing just her up before we bring the scenery up, we're sort of isolating her and separating her from the scene until she starts interacting with it, right? Lots of warm lights, gels and psych to match the sunlight. It's hotter than hell this day. Again, that's a great thing when you're putting together your concept, to reference specific lines, specific things from the script that give you the motivation for some of the things that are those direct, those driven design concepts. No shadows to create the illusion of the sun being on top of the sky, midday, hottest part of the day. You know, that's what we're looking at for that. Background sound of chatter. It's party in the downtown area. The downtown of a city is never quiet, right? So having some of that ambient noise that tells the audience, you know, that we're in a city, perhaps, you know, you've got some car noise, you've got perhaps an airplane flying over, but also you've got some birds chirping and stuff like that to indicate that we're outside, that it's a park, that it's a more natural part of a city environment, right? And then the fenced in area can look ridiculous to contrast the regular downtown city area. Adding a cool gobo texture or maybe some effects over it, mismatched size of fences rather than one plain continuous block. And here's again where we get into more of that artistic choice design. This designer has chosen to say, we're going to visually separate out this area where this ridiculousness is happening from the rest of the environment that we're creating, this downtown area that is much more realistic and mundane. Right? So then one more, which you've already gotten a sneak preview of. So this next one, the setting, a more realistic setting, not very heavy lighting, just entertaining the audience. So we're looking at something that's fun. Again, this script is kind of silly, so thinking about what the story we're telling our audience is, that we're entertaining the audience. A downtown of some city, Steph walks into a private park or someone's yard with a fence. So this designer has focused more on the park being a more secluded private area rather than the more public park. So that's one of those things that as we develop our design and we start to put these designs together, we have to sort of find the balance of those. Right? How private is this park? Very hot summer, present day and recent, and early evening. So again, we have a slightly different artistic choice here. This designer has chosen to set it in early evening, where the previous was thinking it was midday, hottest part of the day, right? So you're looking at two different ideas and how those influence that. So we'll talk briefly about how you join those concepts together in a little bit. Okay. Then we got one more section. The previous two, this one and the previous one, were worked on by a team, which is how it works sometimes. Sometimes your lighting designer and your scenic designer are in fact the same person. Sometimes your design team has worked together a bunch and they start, you know, they do the whole process as a group, all of which are valid things. And sometimes your designers are spread all over the country and, you know, are working on their own except for occasional meetings. So you have to be able to adjust to those. So this is the lighting design that ties into the previous scenic design. Mainly warm tones, but not super warm. When Steph talks to the audience, brighter on her. Warm gel colors are 14 on the side and 07 on the front, and cool gels are 61 from the front and are 65 from the side. So a couple things about this one. In your design concept, be strong in your ideas. The question mark there, you can delete that. I mean, you don't have to be totally set in your ideas, but you should be sure of what you're thinking of. The worst we can do is say, yeah, that's not going to work. As the director, the worst I can do to you is say, I don't agree with that. Let's come up with a different idea, right? If you are working with a team that actually, you know, cares about their show and cares about collaborating, they're not going to judge you for having a choice that is different. They're not going to judge you for changing your mind, because that's part of what theater is, right? The other thing we're looking at here is the lighting designer, in this case, has specified gel colors, which, if you are familiar with lighting gel colors, those numbers make a lot of sense to you. However, if you're not, they don't make as much sense to you. But very cleverly, our designer has provided us with an image. So even if you don't know what R14 and R07 mean, this image gives you the feel of what they're going for. the warms, how warm it is. This designer, again, like we said, they talked about it being early evening. So you've got the sun lower in the sky, you've got some deeper shadows, you've got some cool spots under the tree that are kind of your contrast to that. So the image helps tie in, even though you don't necessarily know what those gel colors mean, this tells you the answer to that. So that's the power of adding images to your text, can go a long way for that, right? So once you've come up with your concept, obviously the next thing we have to do is get to our concept, right? So here's where y'all got to start interacting with me, because what we want to look at is what those design concepts that we have looked at, these various designers have come up with, and how do we incorporate them into an overall design concept for our whole show, right? That's the next thing we need to look at. So here we go. What are some of the items that we have chosen to have as part of our show, right? What are the concepts that have been put out so far? Throw them up in the chat or unmute yourself if you want.
Well, I think we've always, like, every single one of them has had some sort of yard or park with a fence. It just depends on where exactly we're talking about.
It should be much more effective if my typing actually registered on my screen. All right, so we got a yard or a park with a fence. What else? When is our show set? Both time of day, time of year, time of history.
Well, I think we've kind of said, it seems like we're saying present day. There's nothing to indicate otherwise.
I'm adding some things from the chat as we go. Hopefully they'll actually start to show up on the screen shortly. Present day, hot. Fences. It's much harder to type without spelling things wrong when you can't see anything you're typing. So we've got chairs, tables, gate. Get rid of some windows, see if that helps things speed up just a hair. Yeah, that's just embarrassing. And that's better. All right. It seems to actually be typing now. All right. Okay, so we've got midday versus evening, summer versus spring. We've got downtown noise. Anything I'm missing? Party noise. Normal looking. All right. How about some of the less concrete things? Mood or contrasts or that sort of thing that we want to bring out, or things about specific characters that we want to bring into the discussion for the overall design concept. Okay, that's a good one. Colby says contrast between so we've got a contrast between the sidewalk and its heat and the yard. We've got a possible costume or lighting contrast to separate Steph and the other actors. Mark, not Dark, Mark and Dina. Right? Anything else you can think of that we want to sort of hit on? Okay. Chairs for the height difference. If you come up with anything else, we'll start talking about these. But if you come up with anything else, feel free to throw them in the chat, because one of the things about the process of design is as you're going and as you're interacting with the other designers, as you're sharing these ideas, sometimes another idea will pop into your head to sort of spur a new train of thought that can help build on the things, or even potentially sometimes you'll have an idea and you'll be like, well, what about this? And all of your other designers will suddenly be like, oh, actually, I really love that. And it could shift the entire concept a little bit. So when we're looking at our design concepts here, the yard or a park with a fence, one of the things we have to decide then as designers is it a yard? That is it a very private area that Steph is wandering past, where somewhere she wouldn't normally feel compelled to go in, or even necessarily think about going into? Or is it a public space where the situation is sort of putting itself onto her everyday thing? So a better way to sum that up might be, is Steph entering Mark and Dina's space, or have Mark and Dina come into Steph's space in this world that we're living in, right? To define that, how private is this area? How set away from the rest of the world of our show is this location? We're not going to start to answer these questions yet. We're going to look at what the questions are, because one of the important things when you're in this stage of design is you don't want to start to narrow down your choices yet. You want to have them as wide as possible, so as you're processing the different thoughts, you can develop the ideas fully before you start eliminating things, right? I think we've all agreed that it's present day. There are a lot of indications in the script that sort of help lead that. It's not a real specific time period, but we know that Steph is wearing flip-flops. She specifically says that. We know that the situation is such that, you know, it's not very far removed from our current time period. Is it set this year? Is it set 10 years ago? Is it set 20 years ago? The script doesn't really give us any guidance on that. So as designers, we have to figure that out, right? So, and then as far as the setting, fences, chairs, tables, the gate, the grassy area, those are all, again, driven design. They're specifically mentioned. Many of those things are interacted with by the actors. And in fact, the chairs and tables are specifically required for what the show does, right? What are Mark and Dina doing? The plot fairly strongly centers on them using this furniture, right? Time of day, midday versus evening. Again, a decision we have to make at some point, which will influence the ideas of what our color, what are lighting angles, all of those sorts of things. Summer versus spring. Again, it says it's very hot, but there's kind of a, there's a difference between a really hot spring day and a really hot summer day, right? A really hot spring day can be, everybody loves potentially. The characters, especially Steph's feelings about the day could vary significantly if it's, that first really hot day in spring when you're like, oh wow, summer's finally coming, versus a really hot day well into summer where you've had a bunch of hot days in a row and it's just kind of an oppressive heat, right? So those influence, again, our concept of the world beyond just the show. Downtown noise. How big is this downtown? Are we, downtown Chicago? Are we downtown Grayslake? Are we downtown in some tiny little town there where downtown is 5 whole buildings, right? Party noise. What kind of party? Is it just Mark and Dina that are creating this party environment? Is there an actual party going on around them? Do we have more characters besides just the 3 that are named and are talking? Is there a group with Mark and Dina, right? The contrast between the sidewalk and the yard. So here we're getting again into some of the more artistic design choices. How do we indicate, is the contrast between the heat of the sidewalk and the city and all of that a part of why Steph notices this cooler park-like spot, the yard and that sort of thing? Does that contrast help build that, or is that contrast simply more along the lines of helping the audience differentiate between the 2 worlds of this show? And then that ties into a possible lighting and or costume difference between Steph and Mark and Dina, right? How do we differentiate? Again, I said as the director that I want the things that are unrealistic to be very unrealistic. Are Steph and Mark's attitudes and actions the part that's completely different, or does it come into how they're dressed and how their physical appearance, right? Who are Mark and Dina and why are they doing this? These are the kinds of questions that as designers we have to start to answer. And then the chairs for the height difference. Obviously in the script it specifically says these chairs make them very tall. How big are the chairs? Are they normal sized chairs? What kind of chairs are they? Are they just typical boring wooden chairs? Are they something a little more extravagant? Are they normal sized? Are they proportionate to the actors, or are they oversized? There's some indication in the script that perhaps the chairs are literally their shoes in such a way that they have to be attached to the feet and move with the actors, which again is a very important consideration if you are the costume designer or props designer, because that's one of those sorts of things that if the director said, no, I want the chairs to literally be their shoes, as a designer, your first thought is going to be, okay, how do we pull that off in a way that doesn't make the actors unsafe and that doesn't take us out of the world of the show? How do we do this? Obviously, from a physical movement standpoint, a full-size chair attached to each foot of an actor is going to create a really big challenge in terms of acting and moving around and doing the things the people need to do in the show. It also ties into the idea that if these people literally have shoes strapped to, or chairs strapped to their feet, there's going to be a sound issue as well, because every time they move, you're going to get a clomp, clomp, thud sort of sound, right? So those are all considerations that we have to take into account as we sort of revise this concept. So let's loop back now that we've kind of put all these ideas out here. And again, we're not trying to, at this point, it's still completely viable to throw new ideas out, to say, hey, this just occurred to me, or I was thinking maybe instead of A, we do B, okay? So feel free to pipe in at any time, jump in the chat. The whole point of this exercise is that it is collaborative, and collaboration doesn't really work very well if only one person is giving input. So I'd really appreciate it if you don't make me be that one person, okay? So I am going to switch over real quick. So you can see me. Hi, everybody. All right, so what are we looking at here? Arguments for or against it being a yard versus a park. Anybody have any thoughts on that one?
I kind of like the yard idea because it's the idea of Steph like entering their space.
Okay.
Instead of them doing it out in the open.
Okay, and so that gives us the concept that, you know, if Steph is coming into their space, then in the world of our play, that makes, in the world that Mark and Dina inhabit, that makes Steph the weird one. Even though everything about what's happening in that space is weird to Steph and weird to us as the audience, within the world that Steph is coming into, she's the weird one, right? Ashar says he prefers the idea of the yard because it seems like a more secluded section of Mark and Dina's world, unknown to most other people. So again, by establishing that Steph is coming into this world, we're making Steph the outsider, Steph the one that's not fitting the norms of the environment that Steph is going into, right? So that gives us the opportunity to kind of play with the idea of what is or isn't normal. In this case, we're looking at the fact that if Steph is coming into this space, then the world that Mark and Dina inhabit, they have to hold completely seriously, right? If Mark and Dina in any way as characters indicate that what they're doing is strange, it'll break that mood for the audience. And so we as designers have to make sure that whatever choices we make in relation to the weirdness of this environment, we own them. We make them choices that are not just weird for weirdness sake, but are weird within the structure of what is normal to this weird world. And Colby suggests that when she peers over the fence, the script makes it seem like Mark and Dina are in a different world. When she enters, the setting is different, alien, and I think that Steph is certainly the outsider and can be played for laughs with the audience. So again, one thing we do have to be careful as designers is not to try to direct the show with our design. As a director, you know, the director has to make the choices on how the actors behave. But if we design, if we go with this idea that Steph is actually the outsider, Steph is actually the strange one, then as designers, if we go in with the goal that when Steph talks about something being strange, the audience is going to agree with Mark and Dina that Steph is the strange one. And so Colby suggests that Steph could be played for laughs with the audience, that if we manage things right, and if the director likes the idea, which I am the director and I do, we can sort of turn this script on its head and make Steph the person who the audience doesn't identify with, even though Steph is the person on the stage that the audience is in theory most similar to. So now that we've established that portion of the concept, that's going to influence the rest of our design concepts. So this in the structure of our world, the scene that the play takes place in is its own separate reality with its own separate rules from the more natural outside area around it. So one of the things we have to think about then is, how do we indicate that break? One thing we can look at is saying, okay, now that we've established this, how do we make what's outside that area indicate that it is almost, in order to get where we're going, what is outside needs to be almost uncomfortably normal. So we may use that to influence our design decision. In the designs that mentioned, the downtown area visible outside is that somehow set up in a way where maybe the buildings are either incredibly uniform, like every building looks the same and has the same theme, or if we want to go with a more kind of social commentary sort of way, is it that it's surrounded by these big chain stores? There's a Walmart and a McDonald's and these places that are exactly the same no matter where you go, right? A McDonald's in Illinois looks the same as a McDonald's in California, which looks the same as a McDonald's in Germany. That's their whole thing, is that when you walk into a McDonald's, you know you're in McDonald's and you know what you're going to get and you know what you're going to have. And it's a comforting thing, right? So no matter where you go, McDonald's is a constant. So are we using that concept, or are we going for something almost more cartoonish where everything outside is a box of a building with a sign over the door that says something like clothes, food, so very ultra normal, nothing at all to challenge the imagination or the ideas around it, right? So those, again, that brings up another choice to make. Ellie suggests lighting and sound changes, making a strong transition between Steph walking by outside and then what's happening inside our park or yard or whatever we want to call it, right? So if we've got that oppressive, overbearing kind of summer heat feel to it, and then as soon as she opens that gate, there's a shift in that feel that's going to take the audience out of one environment and pull them into this new environment, right? So I think one of the things, I'm going to do a quick shift over here. So one of the things we've decided is that our yard or park is a private park. I am not even remotely on the right keys there. So it's a private park, secluded and cut off from the surrounding area. It's its own just embarrassing how bad I type when people are watching me now. All right, so we've got that it's its own separate world, and within that world, it is the real world. Present day is the next thing on our list. I think that's something that we didn't have a whole lot of conflict on. And then unless somebody as a designer has a more specific concept, I think we can make it very generic in time, that it's just recent, which will decide our costume choices. But we've also said that, you know, Steph is the outsider here. So again, the same as with scenery, we might start thinking about what that means for Steph's costume. Is Steph, you know, is it in the same vein of her costume is almost oppressively, disturbingly normal, right? Is it, you know, are we going to almost take like a stereotype and make it the costume? Or the example that pops into my mind, which doesn't work for this script, was the kind of like joke a few years ago about the basic white girl uniform with the Uggs and the black tights and the long sweater, right? And the Starbucks cup with pumpkin spice latte, which by the way are delicious. So no judgment there. But you know, where you would see these pictures and it would instantly put in your mind, you know, this is somebody who is not making any effort to challenge the norms around them. So that can influence our choices for costumes. And then what does that mean for Mark and Dina? What are their costumes like? How over the top are we going to go with those? So when we're looking at costuming, how do we define Steph's character through costume? And then how do we define Mark and Dina's character through costume? How outlandish are Mark and Dina's clothes, right? I personally think, as the director, that I don't want to go so far out that they're in like weird alien costumes. But I think bringing a contrast in terms of like color and shape into those costumes, maybe things are oversized, maybe things have extra movement and pattern and stuff like that. Maybe they're, you know, tie-dye or some sort of crazy print or something like that. Maybe the clothes are looser. Colby suggested Hawaiian shirts, you know, something like that would be a great way of doing it, where it's still something normal and everyday that fits within the larger world, but in comparison to what Steph is maybe wearing, it is outlandish and over the top. You know, maybe, and as a costume designer, you may be looking for things like, maybe I can find a Hawaiian shirt that the pattern on it is chairs or shoes or something that ties in. It brings you the idea that, again, Steph lives in one reality and Mark and Dina live in a completely different reality, right? And how those worlds butt up against each other. So we've kind of developed the idea of what it being in the present day means for us. The next thing we're going to look at is that it's hot. We know it's hot. The script specifically says hot. It says it's hotter than hell, right? So that again influences, how do you make this environment hot for an audience when you can't do something like literally turn up the temperature in the theater, which would be a terrible choice for most shows. Also not real practical for most shows. But we can do that through color. We can do that through how Steph is dressed. Like I said, we know she's in flip-flops. We know she's, you know, that it's super hot out, so we're not going to put her in a jacket. We're not going to put her in anything that counteracts the idea that it's hot. However, again, with contrasting her with Mark and Dina, is there a difference in how they're costumed? Is there a difference in the environment? If we're thinking that once she transitions from the outside world to the inside world of Mark and Dina's world, does she contrast with them in the level of dress? If this area that Mark and Dina inhabit is cooler and more comfortable than the world outside, are they dressed a little more heavily? Do they have more substance to their costume. You know, are they in long pants and or a long skirt or whatever, to contrast with that. So comparing those. It also, you can compare, you know, if the idea is to portray that heat at the beginning, maybe Steph is in warm colors, oranges, reds, or whatever, or again, tying back into the concept of the normality of it, is she in very neutral colors? And you can have colors that are both warm and neutral. You can have like, and sometimes this is hard to wrap your mind around. You can have a warm gray. You can have like khaki or tan colors that are still warm, but simultaneously very neutral in terms of how they read to the audience, right? So those are considerations that come into play both with our lighting and our costumes and even our scenery. As you design, as a scenic designer, the area outside the park versus the area inside the park, you're going to think about how the lighting will interact with your set pieces. How, you know, when you light it up with a warmer light, is the surface that you're using going to read with that sort of hot thing? And one of the ways you can do that is a contrast in texture. When you look at, one of you mentioned in your design concept, the concept of this marble-like sidewalk, these hard surfaces. We know from experience, when you go outside on a hot day, the grass feels lovely and the concrete burns the crap out of your feet, right? So even just that texture difference, you know, when you outside on a hot day, looking at the surface, how hot it's going to feel on your bare feet, right? And even if you're wearing shoes, you have that conscious thought about it. And you look at a wooden surface and you know that's not going to be quite as hot as a stone type surface. And a grass surface is going to be all the more so a cooler feel. So by contrasting hard surfaces with more organic surfaces, you can also sort of bring that hot versus cool into your concept of the scenic design. And the same thing works with costumes. Loose flowing clothes are going to feel less restrictive and oppressive than more tight-fitting, more conventional clothes, right? So the temperature influences the decisions. Next, we're looking at the sort of larger props, which sort of brings us into the idea of props versus scenery versus costumes. As designers, there's a lot of things that kind of overlap from one to the other. If you think about chairs, who's responsible for deciding what the chairs look like? Is that the scenic designer? Is that the props designer? If the chairs are attached to the actor's feet, is it the costume designer? And the answer, of course, is this is a collaborative environment. So the answer, of course, is yes. Everyone is sort of responsible for anything that touches their department and needs to participate in the discussion of figuring out what that means, both in terms of who designs it, but also in terms of who builds it, right? If these chairs need to be attached to the actor's feet, then the costume department has to have input on making sure they're going to fit on the actor's feet, because, well, human beings have this annoying process, or annoying habit of being not all the same size, which is very inconvenient when you're a costume designer, because you can't just say, okay, this shirt is what I want. You also have to make sure that it will fit the actor, right? So to that extent, you know, the fences, the chairs, the table, all of those sorts of things. And again, deciding which things fit into Mark and Dina's world and which things fit into Steph's outside world, right? So are the chairs, which I think in this case it's fairly obvious, are part of Mark and Dina's world. The fence is a transition point. So how much does the fence tie into the outside world and how much does it tie into the inside world? And does that depend on where the fence is on stage? If we're looking at the stuff that we see with Steph that may be downstage, that we see at the beginning when Steph is still in that outside world versus the same fence upstage where we're seeing the inside that is in Mark and Dina's world, how is it the same? How is it different? Is it something as simple as the outside is brick and on the inside there's ivy on that brick? Or is it a completely different texture and feel to the inside? So those are, again, decisions you would have to make as a scenic designer. And again, that ties into lighting and that sort of thing too. The other thing you have to always consider too as a scenic designer is your actors are going to be in front of your scenery. So contrasting their clothing with the background in such a way that they don't just sort of blend in, you know, if the actors are in blues and greens and you've covered that back wall with blues and, you know, bluish green and green ivy, there's a chance that the audience is going to lose the actors in that visual background. And so you have to kind of balance that as well. So those are things to consider when we're looking at it. What time of day is it? One of our design concepts suggested that it was midday, the hottest part of the day. One suggested that it was early evening. And I think this ties into the next choice, the summer versus spring. You know, what is the mood we want to portray with this contrast between our inner world and outer world? Do we want to go with this like super oppressive middle of summer, just want to get out of it feel for Steph? Or do we want Steph's normal world to be something that she really wants to come back to because she likes it? It's a lovely spring day, or it's early evening where you're just starting to get the relief from that heat, right? So that's a decision we have to make. So what are your thoughts on that concept? What are the advantages and disadvantages of deciding summer versus spring?
I was kind of leaning towards having it be summer just because it kind of feels like an oppressive heat in the thing.
Okay. And that's a good way to phrase that. Obviously, as you read the script, you get a feel for the world it's in. That's what that first reading is about, is that what is this world that we're in, right? That we talked about doing the 3 readings. So Ellie very definitely says she feels a warmth, an oppressive heat, right? Any other thoughts on that? It alters the way the audience sees the situation, Colby says. I agree with the idea of summer, as if the heat is oppressive and the setting is extremely normal. It creates a motivation for Steph to go into the yard. Yeah, so getting into the motivation of why our characters behave the way they do. Why does Steph look into this yard? Why does she decide to go in and see what's happening? That's not a normal thing to do since we've decided this is a private area, right? You don't normally go, hey, what's going on over there? I'm going to wander in and see, right? That's a little bit strange, which then fits into our idea that Steph is, in fact, the strange one in this world. So by creating this oppressive heat, creating this sort of motivation to get out of this incredibly mundane world that we're putting together, what does, you know, we've given her a reason to transition into this other world. So I think the summer heat and the midday heat is a good way to look at it. And so I think as a design team and director, that's what we're going to go with now, right? All right, so the downtown noises and the party noises are kind of next. What are those noises? What do we hear in the background? How intensely do we hear those sounds? How strong is this sound and how does it move and encompass the world of the show. Any thoughts on that?
I think maybe my first thought was to start with like a louder noise outside in Steph's world, and then once you cross into Mark and Gina's area, all the sound drops down because then it's like you're entering a completely different space.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good thought in terms of, you know, as much as you do with a transition in scenery or a transition in lighting, you can make that same kind of transition with your sound. You can take, again, that outside world, that very normal, almost oppressively normal world. So maybe what we're hearing is, you know, cars and vehicles going by, but maybe we play with that a little bit, and it's a loop of traffic noise to the point where maybe the audience doesn't pick up on it at first, but eventually realizes it. You're hearing the same truck pass by every 35 seconds, and you hear the same cars and the same airplane go over, and this, that, and the other thing. And maybe, you know, maybe that time span is longer than the 35 seconds or whatever. Maybe we use that to sort of reinforce that idea that this world is very ordered and structured and boring, right? Colby says it alters the way the audience sees the situation. I agree with the idea of summer as the heat is oppressive in the setting. Oh, that's the part I already read. I'll read the new part now. Human conversations, passing cars, faint wind. I imagine the location as a sort of small town, so I think the noises would be quiet, and I think having the sounds fade out as she enters the yard is a great idea. Excuse me. All right, so yeah, it does then come into yet another decision we have to make, is what kind of outside environment is this? Is it a large city? Is it a small city? Ellie suggested every minute on the minute you hear a New Yorker yell at someone. So that's a great sentence in that it encompasses both the concept of this repetition, but also that sort of like ingrained knowledge we have when Ellie says a New Yorker yelling at someone. That's a very specific feel that we have, that even if you've never been to New York, you sort of know what that phrase means, right? You know what's going on. Colby says, aggressive New York accents, yes, please. That again becomes a director choice. Obviously, accents are a thing, but maybe that influences how we decide. If, as a director, I say, yeah, we're in New York City, you know, this is a small park in the neighborhood, but Steph is going to have that heavy like New York accent and the stereotypical attitude of "don't mess with me," which there is some indication in the script that that's a completely valid choice for that, right? You know, when we're looking at, let me pop over to our script real quick. There's kind of a, trying to find it there. I just passed it. Again, the computer not responding very quickly. Like this line. You wear your brown shoes, I'll wear these. I'm quite good at wearing these. You know, there's that sarcasm and that sort of like, I don't care about what you want. I'm going to do my thing, that Steph has going on here, right? So when we're looking at that, we get an idea of, again, that starts to shape Steph's character, which then in turn shapes her costuming. It also, if we're going with that, it's going to influence how the director directs that actor, you know, is maybe they started off doing it as just this kind of generic, you know, there wasn't a specificity to that, but now we've got this sort of like strong New York feel to it that we're suggesting that we put in. And that's also the sort of thing that, you know, maybe it doesn't happen because maybe the actor isn't comfortable with it. Maybe the actor comes up with a different choice that works better. So as we design, we have to be completely flexible on things like that. You know, there's a limit to it. You can't rebuild the set once it's been built just because an actor makes a different choice. The different parts of the design and the directing and the process feed back on each other and shape each other, though. All right. So what else are we looking at? Costume differences, lighting differences. We've covered kind of both of those already a little bit, but how we contrast them. And then again, once we look at that, the lighting and the costumes and the scenery all have to sort of coordinate and work together so that you don't end up putting red light on green costumes and making them look kind of muddy brown, right? If the designers, the costume designer and the lighting designer are on totally different pages, you can run into conflicts. If the scenic designer and the costume designer are on different pages, you can run into conflicts, like I said, with the actors disappearing into the background, right? And then the last thing we had is the chairs for the height difference. Obviously, from our script, the chairs are an important part of the script. The chairs are their shoes or being used as shoes, depending on how we want to do that. And as the director of this production, I'm kind of torn on that because as interesting as I think it would be to actually have the actors strapped to these chairs, there's also the indication in the script that they're moving across different pieces of furniture, which becomes terrifying in terms of safety if these people have some sort of chair strapped to their shoe. However, it could be something where maybe, like Steph's flip-flops, they're something that fits loosely, and when they're on ground level, they're on their chairs and they use them as shoes, but they can step out of them easily to move to other pieces of furniture for the dance piece. Which, again, this is one of those things where I hadn't really given that a whole lot of thought, and now that I have, I really like the idea that the shoes are something they can walk while wearing, but that they can come off and move to other furniture and other levels. So as the director, I'm going to say that's what we're going with. So the costume designer has to figure out, probably in conjunction with the props designer, how those shoes work. The other consideration we have to get into, and this comes later in the design process, and we'll talk about it next week, is how you're going to execute that design element, how you're going to build chairs that are shoes that actors can walk in but also get in and out of easily, right? The practical considerations of the execution of the design add a level of complexity to this that, as a technician, I would say, oh dear God, I hate you. Always with love, when the director tells me that. But it's a super fun challenge at the same time, right? And it does influence the rest of our scenery, because if the whole idea that we're doing with this is that Mark and Dina never leave the furniture and come down to the ground level that Steph is on, then maybe that influences how the rest of the furniture and the rest of the environment is laid out. So we have to think about, like, how do they move from furniture piece to furniture piece? How do they get in and out of those chairs, and how do they get on and off stage? Because it mentions that Dina actually, excuse me, Duna actually leaves the stage, leaves the scene. And we also have to make the decision, does she leave completely off stage to where the audience can't see her, or does she just take herself out of the immediate environment of Mark and Steph interacting? Where does she go when she walks away, right? So these are the decisions you have to make as designers, and then each element of it is you go back, once you've made these decisions, you refine your original idea, you make it more specific and more in line with the work as a whole, and then you come back and you do it again. And it's a reiterative process where each time you get together with your other designers and your production team, you're refining the concept. You're refining what the show is going to be in the end, right? So now that we've taken the various ideas that we have as designers, as the production team here, and we've narrowed it down some, the next step is going to be to do your first revision of your concepts, right? You're going to look at the ideas you have originally and the ideas that we have shifted to, and you're going to refine those, and you're going to say, okay, now instead of just this image I have in my head of what this looks like, I can be more specific about, okay, this is roughly how big I want the chairs to be, or this is how tall the wall is, this is the material of the wall, this is where the light is coming from in my lighting design. Is most of my light coming from straight on? Is it coming from natural angles? Is it coming from unnatural angles? Those sorts of things. You start picking out specific gobos, maybe. You start picking out specific costume concepts. And it may not be the final idea of the costume that you're looking at, but it is the... All right, I think I lost you guys for a minute there. Okay, but I'm back. Hopefully that doesn't completely destroy the recording. All right, sorry about that. Hopefully I'm back and everything is working again, and we can continue on. Now I just gotta find the chat window again. Okay, can you guys hear me now? Okay. All right, so where was I when I disappeared? Talking about refining our new concepts. Okay, so now that you've gotten to that point, I'm guessing you missed my thing about costume design. Costume designers have it almost the hardest at this stage because actors annoyingly come in different sizes and shapes. If I order a 2x4 to build scenery out of, I'm going to get the same size piece of wood regardless of where I order it from. I can design scenery using that knowledge. I can make plans and I can start drawing up specific drawings and that sort of thing much earlier in the process. The costume designer can't really make any final decisions until the show has been cast and you know what size your actors are and how they fit in relation to each other and on the stage and all of that sort of thing. So you have to still keep those ideas general, but you start making them more specific at this point. So that's kind of the next step in our design process. So here is your home fun, because it's not work, right? It's fun. So for our Thursday meeting, find 3 to 5 images that sort of fit into our refined overall design concept and send them to me. You have my email address. Include text to explain your choices if you want, and I will try to put that together into something where we can, again, do another layer of refinement and start moving towards what the process of turning it into something that our technicians and our crew and everything, we can start getting it ready to execute and build and put onto the stage. So that's what we've got going on next. And then next on Thursday, we'll talk about how to finalize those concepts and get them to a more concrete form that we can build. All right, any questions or anything like that? Oh, Ellie has a very good question. Are we designing this for a theater like Central or North? So a proscenium or a black box? For the purposes of this show, I am going to say we're going to design for a black box. For those of you who are not familiar with the layout at North, the stage is about 25 feet wide and about 15 feet deep, and the audience is on 3 of the sides of the theater. So the audience is on the left, right, and in front of the stage looking in. So you've got the stage, and the stage comes down all the way into the audience. So this has an impact on your scenic design, obviously, because part of what we've talked about is the walls of this park. But if you put walls on the side, then a huge chunk of your audience can't see. Entrances to the stage at North are there are 2 wide openings all the way upstage on the left and the right, and then there's 2 aisles that come in at the downstage corners of the acting area that you can have actors enter from. So that is a very good and important question, Ellie. Thank you for asking it. Any other questions? All right, then. Go ahead and stop the recording now.